It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have a pet project of John's going on. For the longest time, he has had this idea for a show because he has a theory that the U.S. economy and the UFC sort of are kind of smoky mirror images of each other. John, you lay it out exactly what the premise is.
Well, I actually talked about this before when I was on Cardiff Garcia's The New Bazaar. Mm-hmm. We talked about this idea of the UFC is, I view it as a microcosm of the U.S. economy. It actually works as an analogy to the U.S. economy. And even more than analogy, I guess, just the economy, but the labor market specifically. The UFC fighters work as almost a exaggeration. You know, the impact we see in the UFC is perhaps an exaggerated version of what we see in the U.S. economy from the impact on labor from the neoliberal turn and neoliberalism over the last 40, 50 years. And this also is a preview, if you want, of the book I've been working on with Jacob Devitt, formerly of SureDog. So we have this idea fits a lot into that book. So anyways, that's the preamble, I guess.
You talk about neoliberalism. There's a lot of people out there that don't understand what that means. So can you tell us what is neoliberalism and what was the neoliberal turn?
Neoliberalism is a term that's misused a lot. You see it thrown around as a pejorative. It's everything is labeled neoliberalism now. But when I use, I'm pretty specific about what I'm talking about. When I talk about neoliberalism, I am talking about it. First of all, I want to point out, I'm not talking about capitalism. People always talk about neoliberalism and they use it almost interchangeably with capitalism. I'm not talking about capitalism. When I'm talking about neoliberalism, I'm talking about the concept that took over, first started the Great Depression, but really I'm talking about what took over in the 70s on is this ideology of basically undoing the New Deal, and in Europe as well, undoing the regulated market capitalism that the governments put in place from the Great Depression and during the war period. So that post-war 30-year period of regulated capitalism. The neoliberalism I'm talking about is the idea that you're going to undo that. And the neoliberalism turn is in the 70s when, after the Powell memo, and if people aren't familiar, Supreme Court Justice Powell was appointed by Nixon, wrote a memo right before joining the court where he sent it out to the Chamber of Commerce saying how the American business leaders and stuff have to retake America from the from the communists and the New Dealers. So from that point on, we started changing our laws, our rules, started having a different mindset and undoing a lot of the New Deal stuff that tilted the leverage towards labor over capital. And now we were going back to the traditional period where all through history seems to be the standard that capital has more leverage, it has more power than labor. So that's what the New Deal, not the New Deal, but neoliberalism in my head is. Neoliberalism is a return to the pre-World War II, pre-New Deal form of almost laissez-faire. I shouldn't say laissez-faire capitalism, but the idea that capital, money, has more rights, more leverage than labor, and undoing the power and leverage that we gave labor.
When you say the New Deal, explain to everyone what composed the New Deal.
Well, the New Deal was a series of laws that were passed by Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s in response to the Great Depression. But when we talk about the New Deal and New Deal era, here I'm not just talking about all the laws that the New Deal passed. These are the specific laws that basically built the middle class in America. These are the laws that were put in place that made a regulated market. It's a capitalist economy, still capital. It's capitalism, but regulated capitalism. So it's stuff like the Wagner Act that made it easy to make unions, and then union growth exploded. It's stuff that had a short span. I would include in it too, like the War Board, the National Labor War Board, which oversaw labor during the World War II period, but it made it much easier make unions during that time. It's stuff like the introduction of the minimum wage, Social Security, just a whole string of rules and regulations. It's Thurman Arnold running the antitrust department and coming down hard, and finally using the Sherman Act to go hard after monopolies. So it's a wave of laws that came about during FDR's reign, and then I guess his heir apparent in Truman, that tilted the balance in favor of the working class and the workers over capital.
Why do you think fighters work as stand-ins for the regular working class?
Well, I guess the reason I look at UFC fighters is they share something a lot of the lower tiered, lower on the social economic ladder people have, workers, and that is they are precariat. Most fighters are precariat in the sense that the precariat class are people that do not exist without predictability and just security in their jobs, right? So these are people that they worry that they could be fired any moment, that there's high unemployment in the economy. So if they lose their jobs, that they're going to be in trouble, that they're working paycheck to paycheck, they can't afford to make their rent, they don't know what the future, they have no savings, I think what I just read off sounds like a pretty good description of a UFC fighter, right?
Oh,
I guess
yes.
MMA fighter in whole, but I use the UFC specifically because, as we'll go down longer, that a lot of these seem more specifically to apply to them. But yeah, I think they stand in perfectly with the working classes that saw their conditions get more precariat as we undid a lot of the New Deal policies. And so that's why I use them for that. And I mean, I guess, again, as you look through the fighters, there's no, fighters don't have health care. Fighters don't have pension plans. Fighters don't have just a whole list of stuff that makes their life more precariat. And those are also things that a lot of people have lost over the last few decades.
And it's funny with the UFC because it's not like the fighters actually had anything to be taken away. They are continually taken advantage of from the start. There's literally nothing they have that they can take away, right?
Well, I guess we could look at it slightly different. They did take some stuff away, but yeah, it wasn't like they took away pensions.
Yes,
a lot of workers lost their pensions, lost their union, lost their factory, was moved south. The fighters didn't quite lose that, but they did lose stuff like the right to have their own sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
They did lose the right, to not have to be woken up in the middle of the night for a drug test. They did lose, I guess, stability because as the market has opened up, the UFC has found it easy to go and get fighters from other countries and territories to replace them. So there is some things they've lost, but nothing like, it's not quite a direct comparison, but it's more, like I said, it's an analogy.
Well, they lost a few other things too. They lost the ability to wear what they wanted to wear. They lost the ability to have their walkouts. Remember, they used to have some really fun walkouts, and they eliminated that. They eliminated a few things there. As you were saying things, lots more things were popping up in my head. Oh yeah, they lost this, they lost that. I mean, they can't even wear their own shoes anymore, right? They have to wear the Rock shoes.
Yeah, and one of the other things they've lost, obviously, we'll get into later, is they lost options.
Yeah.
Before, fighters are like, well, at the very least, I can go to another promotion that pays maybe not as good as UFC, but comparable. And actually, at the time, back in the UFC has exploded since then, but back right after TUP, there were other promotions that paid as well, if not better. And so there were plenty of, look when Babalu got cut by the UFC, he had options to go somewhere else. Yeah. Those options don't 100% exist anymore.
What's the difference between the working classes and the professional classes? And, why are the fighters always going to be in the working class? Let's say like even your Conor McGregor's, your John Joneses, they would, to me, sort of represent the ones that eclipsed everybody else and maybe sit in the capitalist class now, but I'm probably reading this all wrong, which is why you're here.
Well, it is true. They make so much money, you could say they're capitalists. But in some ways, some members of the working class, like professional engine, I should say like plumbers and electricians and other people that don't have formal college degrees can actually make a lot of money. Certain truck drivers can make a lot of money on certain routes, right? So there are members of the working classes, the blue collar professions that make as much money as professional managerial class, members of the professional managerial class or upper classes. There's also members of those upper classes, the white collars that make less than some blue collar workers. The reason I would say UFC fighters compared to other athletes, though, exist in the working classes is because, as we point out, they are a precariat class. They don't have protections. They don't, for the vast majority, they don't make a ton of money. They make more money than the typical worker. But for the bulk of the UFC fighters, they probably make just slightly more than the median worker because what they make is, you got to remember, is gross, not net. When we see those numbers, they have expenses they got to take care of. The promotion doesn't take care of those expenses. They pay for their own training, nutritional supplies. They have to cover a manager. All those things take a big chunk of their paycheck. So if a fighter makes, $80,000 a year on 2 fights, and you're like, well, that's better than the typical American worker makes, you got to remember about a third of that or so might go to his other expenses. And now he's back in the ballpark of the typical American full-time worker. So I look at fighters much more like the working classes because, in addition to that, the pay issue for most of them, there's a few that just, as we said, transcend that and start making tons of money. But what also they don't have is that what the other athletes have is they don't have a labor union or an association protecting them or some sort of, or the regulations that the other fields have. So the other athletes are, often will have pension plans. Even, golfers are independent contractors, right? But they do have massive pension plans. Everybody in the NFL, NBA, there's some form of pension plan. So all of them are a little different. The other thing they have is they have scarcity in their professions. MMA fighter, this is the big difference. MMA fighters don't have any scarcity. The other professions and professional athletes all have scarcity. What I mean by that is there is a limited number. A good comparison I'm going to use is doctors to regular workers. Doctors make ungodly amounts of money. Part of it is because they're highly educated, but American doctors make twice what all the doctors and the rest of the highly developed Western world makes. And they don't make it that much money just because it's hard to be a doctor. They make it because the doctors work together in their association to limit the number of doctors in America, to make it hard to be a doctor. So there's a limited number of doctors, so doctors get paid so much. So the average doctor makes like $350,000 in the U.S. So, and the way they do that is they limit the number of medical school slots. There's more people apply to medical school than get in. They make the MCAT test unnecessary complex with stuff like organic chemistry and physics, stuff that most doctors never have to deal with. So they can push out many people from failing the test. And they mandated practices. They also have mandated practice that a doctor has to be involved, that you have to see a doctor for something, even though we've shown that nurse practitioners do just as good a job. And finally, we require U.S. residency to make sure, unlike the other workers that have to compete with foreign workers, U.S. doctors don't, because we require U.S. residency. So you cannot practice law. I mean, not practice you can't be a doctor in the United States unless you do residency. And there's a limited supply of those spots too. And so the other athletes much more are like the professional class doctors than regular workers, because the other athletes have scarcity. One is the pro teams in the NFL, NBA. They need to win because they're in competition. And so they go out and automatically have to get the best players no matter what to make sure their team is competitive. In boxing, which is almost identical to MMA, what makes boxers have a professional class is they have independent rankings. The promoter can't control that. There's a limited supply of the best highly ranked fighters, and the fighter owns his rank. And so in some ways, as soon as you become a top-ranked fighter, you enter the professional class as a boxer and leave behind. And that's why they make so much money, and leave behind the working classes of the lower-tiered boxers. MMA fighters have no scarcity because there's nothing dictating that you are different than all the other fighters that could replace you.
Let's go back to your Conor McGregors, your John Jones, your Francis Ngannou, to a lesser degree, maybe your Sean O'Malley's. Let's look at that class of fighter and tell me where you would slot those types.
Well, I would say I wouldn't call them professional class per se because they do not have a criteria. They don't have credentials. Usually professional class have credentials, like they have a PhD or they passed a test, the American Bar Association to be a lawyer. They did. They're just very popular. And so they're just like all the other fighters, but they're very popular. And so they're extremely popular, more popular than a lot of the boxers. But why don't they get paid like a boxer? Because they don't have the leverage, because the only way that they get the position to get that popular and make that much money is the UFC serves as a gatekeeper and lets them in and competes. So in many ways, you could say fighters are like we go to the working classes. The doctors did not have to compete. They don't have to compete with globalization in the sense that they don't have to compete with a factory that can threaten to move to Mexico or China, another country, right? The workers there have to concede to keep that factory where it's located. Doctors don't have to compete with imported doctors because we have barriers to prevent other doctors from coming in. UFC fighters have to compete with every fighter because there's nothing that makes them special beyond the fact that they become very popular, that they have their own charisma. But if they get really good and they start asking for a lot, the UFC can just say, we will bring in any other fighter because we dictate who is the number one contender, who is the top 10 fighters.
What about
all those
champions?
Things are dictated by the UFC.
What about champions? Would they supersede anything, or would their class change?
That is the one that you actually have earned something as a champion. You are the champion, I would argue, I would accept the idea that now you've entered some sort of professional class as the champion because you've earned your position. That's hard to take away. The problem is you've already conceded all your leverage to get there.
Okay,
and so
one more real quick before you.
Yeah.
And it relates to this. What about an interim champ? Would they also fall in there, or they have to stay back in the workers' class? I'm sorry, this is fascinating. So,
I would say, yeah, they do. They've earned something as interim champ, and interim champs, as we know, are not really real, right?
Mm-hmm.
In interim champs, so the UFC can strip you eventually, and then after a while, people will forget about you as the current champion has the title. I mean, Tom Aspinall is begotten more noteworthy because he won the interim title. But if something happens and he doesn't fight John Jones and he has some sort of dispute with the UFC, they will strip him. And people will kind of forget he was the interim champ and will not really view him as the true champion. The only one that kind of took advantage of this was Francis Ngannou. He earned the status of champion. So he entered, I guess, in our analogy here, he entered the professional class. He got his doctorate, right? So his life is set. And then his contract was also up, so he could negotiate and use that leverage to get the deals he got. And it's not surprising that he went to boxing, where it is, they are protected. Their rank and title is protected. It's an open market, much more competitive market, so he could see more money over there. But with the interim title, again, the UFC controls it. Often you become interim champion only after signing a long-term extensive contract. And so the time period that you have this credential, being the champion, you might be locked under contract that whole time, and you can never take advantage of the fact that you have this item, the value of the title right now. A good example, again, we're going to go back to boxing really quick. Boxing, there's the sanctioning organizations, right, that make the title. But the value of the sanctioning organization, you don't become because the sanctioning organization gives you a belt, doesn't mean you're a star or that's what makes you the star or a valuable boxer. The sanction, I guess it does in some ways because now you're a champion. What the sanctioning organizations do is they have a history of all the previous people that held the belt. And because they accrued value, because all these different famous people that all the people that watch boxing realize were the best in the world have the belt has gained value. UFC title's the same. UFC just saying you're the champion probably doesn't give you value. What gives it value is that the previous champions at heavyweight for John Jones were, John Jones currently has the heavyweight title. Before him was Francis Ngannou, before him Stipe Miocic, before him Daniel Cormier, and before him Stipe again, then Fabricio Verdum, and going back Kane and going back down the line of people that everybody's realized have value. So you've earned this on merit, this position on your own of being the champion. But the problem is to get the right to earn that position, instead of taking out some student loans and have to pay them back, you have to sign a contract with the UFC where they get to keep the majority of the revenue that you will generate in that position.
You were talking about some changes that happen after the neoliberal change. Show me how that UFC analogy works, like with full employment and how that applies.
Well, yeah, there was the neoliberal turn happened in the 70s, right? And then if we go back from that, after that happened, there's a bunch of things happened to decrease worker power. So, and one of the things that decreased worker power is we've had, this might seem alien to people now because we've had super low unemployment now for a long time, for several years. This is an oddity in my lifetime, and I am in my 50s. So this is this kind of this level we saw one time before in the late 90s. During my entire life, starting in the 70s, the unemployment has generally been above 5% and often much higher, 6, 7, 8%. And the reason is that we had massive, much, much higher inflation than we saw now in the 70s. We had stagflation. And the way they defeated it back then is they raised interest rates and drove up unemployment. And so costs would finally stabilize and go down. And then they kept unemployment. It was Paul Volcker did that. And he probably had to do it at the time for a bunch of reasons. But after Paul Volcker did that in the late 70s, early 80s as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, they kept that unemployment. They viewed 5% as natural full employment and kept unemployment probably between 6 or 7% for most of that time since then. That meant millions of people went without work and were poor and precariat and struggling, that unnecessary because we didn't have to have unemployment that high. And what high unemployment does is what the capital loves high unemployment. Why? Because workers have less power. If a worker holds out or quits a job, you can just grab another worker. If a worker asks for a raise, you can fire and bring in another worker, right? Workers become interchangeable if they do not have some sort of credentials that make them scarce. And so the regular working person that wasn't part of a union or didn't have credentials, they saw their wages stagnate. They rose a little, but not nearly as much as the top because they were easily replaceable because there was constant pressure because someone else wanted their job. They couldn't ask for more. Well, that is identical to what we see with the UFC. Now, last few years, the U.S. economy has gone to kind of full employment. We've had unemployment under 4%. Businesses can't find workers, and that's why wages, especially at the bottom, have risen so much, even faster than inflation. But for UFC fighters, they are permanently stuck in a position because there's a lot more fighters out there, right, than slots in the UFC. And so any fighter, you hear about this all the time. A fighter says, if I don't accept this fight, if I don't do it, someone else will. If I don't accept the title fight, if we try to hold out, someone else will step in and take this title fight. So I have to take it. If I try to hold out for a contract, the UFC can cut me. No one cares. They'll bring someone else into the UFC because fighters have no scarcity. They're easily replaceable because they don't own rank and title themselves. They have nothing. They have nothing that they can take with them. They have nothing that makes them scarce and unique that the UFC needs to deal with. So in that ways, MMA fighting and the UFC, especially we go just talking about the UFC, it is constantly like you're in a business place where there's extremely high unemployment going on because there's a huge number of workers that are currently not working ready for that position as soon as they cut you. And so that is a constant pressure on you and a pressure on wages as well, that people cannot ask for more or hold out or anything because they're easily replaceable. The position will be filled no matter what.
What about unions? Can we do something with unions in here?
Well, I mean, this is one of the more obvious ones is that part of the neoliberal turn was to basically take back power from unions because labor unions had grown to about a third of the private sector workforce at the time. at their peak in the 60s. To go back a little bit, right after World War II, a bill was called Taft-Hartley that kind of limited the power of unions, kind of stopped the spread of them. And then starting in the 80s, after Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, a lot of businesses realized, hey, we can kind of defeat unions and shrink them. And so they put a lot of effort, and union density has just decreased. So from about 30% of all private sector workers were in unions in the 50s, we are now down to like 6% of the private sector. So basically no workers in the private sector are in unions anymore.
And they just had, like, Volkswagen just had a big thing with their auto workers, right? Where they finally were able to unionize. And that was like a big deal, right?
Yeah, I will get back to that in just a second. Because we will get to that in a second. There's some good news happening right now, actually. So union density is driven down. Now, unions do several things. Once when unions have power, there's a lot of studies. Union workers make more than regular workers. If you're in a union, you make more than the typical union because the union can use its leverage to drive up wages. Now, the problem is over the last 40, 50 years, we did all these things like we made trade agreements that made it very easy for capital to move a factory overseas. Well, first they made it very easy to move it to the South where they have right to work states, harder to make unions, or overseas. So if a union workforce unionized or asked for a high increase to their pay, they would say, we're just going to move the factory. So there were certain things that drove down wages besides just defeating the union. It's the free flow of capital and goods that also hurt the ability to make unions and build power to leverage. But unionized workers make more, unionized construction workers make more, unionized my industry. It's pretty obvious if you're in a union, in editing or anything in filmmaking, you make more than the non-union guys on average. So unions increase wages. Now, with the decrease in unions, we've seen those wages decrease, but we also saw that unions, because when you're competing with unionized workforces, non-union workers' pay increased as well, because you, as a non-union company, you have to match the pay that your workers could get going somewhere else that was unionized. You also got to pay more to make sure your workforce isn't so upset that they unionize. And so higher density unionized workforce brings wages up across the board. It also gives working class laborers more power because they can work together with the union to elect officials that represent their interests better, right? All that across the board. So the decrease in union density and union power has greatly impacted labor in America. Now, as you brought up, the one good news is we've seen a change lately on that. We've seen with the current NLRB and the Department of Labor by the Biden administration and the approval ratings of labor, we've seen that unions amongst the public has made a big comeback. We've seen that union organizers and Sean Fain of the UAW, that unions themselves are much more aggressive and proactive than they had been in the past. They're no longer turtling up. They're going out and trying to convert people. The workers themselves are asking for more. They're getting frustrated. And after the UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, negotiated huge increases in Detroit for their union contracts, their collective bargaining agreements, they could now go to the South, which has never really been unionized. They went to Tennessee now and go to these non-union workplaces and say, look what we got in Detroit. And those workers we want that as well. And we've seen them unionize. So I'm going to be interested in next year's Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out to see if the constant decreasing labor union density continues or if it's now finally reversing. I'm hoping it's reversing because this is the first time, and in my lifetime, honestly, the first time in my lifetime that I have seen this kind of energy and this kind of effort by not just the unions, but the National Labor Relations Board together to push unionization in this country.
You know, to your point about unions also driving up wages for non-union workers, the second half of this episode will be available on Thursday. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!